Welcome to Occam's Stubble. Today I'll be discussing the ideas of Dr. Jordan Peterson, where we agree, what I think he has wrong, and what additions can be made to place his ideas into a larger context. Does Peterson reduce Jesus carrying his cross to Sisyphus, pushing his useless boulder? Does he miss significant themes when conceptualizing religious and mythological traditions? Enlightenment? Zen masters? The laughing Buddha? Does he miss Old Testament quotes such as, "The joy of the Lord is my strength," or St. Paul saying that he's learned a valuable secret, how to be content in every situation? Does he miss the ending of many of the mythological stories, where Beowulf becomes the same good king from the beginning of the story, or Rapunzel overcomes her dark alter ego, the witch, and escapes her self-imposed isolation to live happily ever after? Heck, Hercules became a god after his labors. So is Peterson just the summation of Greek tragedy without the Dionysian? What is the value of bringing back a boon to society after the hero's journey, if you never earn any joy for yourself, or if you're simply on a perpetual quest? Well, this wasn't what I expected for my first video, but I'm actually nearing completion of the first in a series of videos that will present my complete system of philosophy, psychology, and the humanities in general. However, I keep finding myself distracted by Peterson. My ideas parallel his in so many ways, I felt the need to highlight the differences, to make the two projects more distinguishable. So it seems like a much better idea to do it as a standalone video, and to cover the major differences all at once. I'm going to assume you have some basic knowledge of his work, but if not, I have links below for 3 videos that are good examples of his thoughts and his personality. I'm hoping to open some of these ideas up to a bit of meta discussion, and I'm quite curious to hear any thoughts you may have about this, or how it relates to my upcoming series. Once I get that going. Also, I'll be kind of curious to see what you think of my jokey sarcasm to content ratio. But enough preamble, let's get started.
You dropped 150 grand on a fucking education you could have got for $1.50 in late charges at the public library.
I've read both his books twice, and even skimmed Maps of Meaning a third time to make sure I had a working knowledge of not just his theory, but the potential applications. And yes, this is my thoroughly underlined copy as proof. As you can tell by the opening, I want to go right at Peterson on his home turf of mythology and religion. But to save time, I'll just bounce quickly between the various traditions, so you can see the themes, but I won't waste time on full explanations or telling all kinds of mythological stories. But feel free to use the Google machine, it is your friend. Your manipulative, privacy-invading friend. But to make this kind of argument believable, I need to give you the briefest description of myself I can muster in
1 minute 40 seconds.
Yeah, that long. It won't be too much, as I'm a guy who obviously wants to remain anonymous. Oh, and here's an outline if you like those kind of things. I have a master's degree that isn't an MA. I'm not an academic, thank heavens. You really wouldn't believe how many people with a string of letters after their names don't read primary text, and when I bring one up, I often get blank stares and eye rolls. I love philosophy, but give me a falsifiable theory any day, or at least something evidenced by common experiences. So I consider this to be my resume. By the time I started my grad work, I had a unique epistemology and a concept of human ontology that I wanted to test out and expand. Now, a textbook is obviously, by its very nature, what less insightful people have to say about the thoughts of more insightful people. And since I wanted to get away from that, in my 20s I committed to having read at least one primary source, book, by every major thinker in human history. It's quite a difficult list to construct or maintain, and although I won't claim to have accomplished it, I could make the argument that I have. Problem is, every time you finish a few books, a few more names get added to that list of major thinkers. Of course, this wasn't limited just to the Western philosophic canon, but includes various religious traditions and Eastern texts as well. The Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, major Upanishads, the Tao Te Ching, Confucius, just to mention a handful. I get distracted here and there, of course, and read a little bit more than just one book. I think I may have read like everything from Nietzsche, but I'm not actually sure. But obviously that doesn't mean I remember it all. In my 30s, I decided to read at least 2 books per disorder listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It turned out to be impossible, as many diagnoses don't even have full books dedicated to them. But I accomplished that goal as well as I could, even occasionally wandering back into the academic journals. Now, Soren Kierkegaard, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Viktor Frankl are a few of the writers who made a particularly strong impact on my thinking. And if you know them, perhaps you already see how this puts me in the same neighborhood of thought as Dr. Peterson.
Idly-ho, neighborinos!
First, and least important on my list of disagreements, on my Minds.com blog I previously posted a criticism that Peterson's use of the phrase postmodern neo-Marxist was nonsense and that it seemed like he didn't understand the terms. However, I've since heard him respond to this essentially by saying something like, "I know it doesn't go together, but that's their fault, not mine. They're the ones that are being incoherent."
Well then, fair enough.
But the second part of the criticism from my blog still stands, and I think recognizing the full truth of the situation would actually help him. Postmodernism is just the easiest tool for neo-Marxists to use. In most cases, they neither believe nor care about the legitimacy of the postmodern critiques. I think we have two groups of intellectuals here. Group one are the Marxists, who use any means necessary to bludgeon the superior arguments of their opponents under the assumption that their revolution will outlive any silly philosophic squabble over details. And any harm done to actual people, oh, that's fine, because, of course, we're the good guys. We're going to usher in the utopian bliss of the people's heaven on earth. Yeah, sure. Hey, is that a skull built into your wall? Group 2 are the actual solipsistic, nihilistic, there is no center types. And if you happen to think that logical coherence is a real thing, well, aren't you quaint? I remember when I was young and naive like that. These two groups are relatively small, but book smart and have decent IQs. Thus, people who may think of themselves as the masses flock to them for marching orders, or just normal people who've only heard that side of the argument and have other things to devote their lives to rather than figuring out what the arguments actually mean. We must help the people now, man! There's no time to define what help actually means. Are you heartless? Here are the useful idiots who are being manipulated by the neo-Marxists, using postmodern theory to convince these people that they're doing God's work. Yeah, I wonder what their God is. The time-tested outcome is, of course, handing control over to a psychopath. I really think if Peterson recognized this distinction, he might have a better way of addressing his arguments to that third group. They certainly crave meaning as well. They're just too scared by stories of boogeymen to even risk thinking about the enemy's arguments. And why should they? All potentially dangerous material should be kept away from children, even if those children are, adults now. Honestly, I think there's so much childish behavior because we continue to treat adults like children. Number 2 is slightly more significant. I've heard him comment that he was opposed to Maslow because he didn't want to tie someone's capacity for moral behavior to their ability to access basic resources and have their needs filled. Maslow directly rejects this connection in his book Toward a Psychology of Being. But to attempt to present Peterson's position in the most generous light, perhaps he's not just flatly incorrect. Peterson may believe that there's a logically inevitable argument from Maslow that makes the two inextricably linked. Thus, he would think that accepting the premises of Maslow also require that you believe a lack of progress up the hierarchy would create moral impairment. Now again, that's not what Maslow argued, and I can't find sufficient reason to believe that linkage is the case myself. Also, part of my project of human ontology is to put together Maslow's hierarchy of needs with Kohlberg's hierarchy of moral development. As for the facts of this situation, no, it's certainly not the case that they are inevitably linked. There are plenty of stories of children doing heroic things to protect their younger siblings, giving up food, taking a beating instead of a sibling. At the same time, it's obvious they're somewhat linked. Poverty increases crime because weighing immediate biological need gratification is obviously going to tax the self-control muscles. So there is certainly some kind of relationship there. That said, if Peterson is using a specifically behavior-defined concept of morality, then I could also see how this lends itself towards judging morality by behavior. As a virtue ethicist, I avoid this problem by seeing behavior as an outgrowth of internal habits. Thus, if you compare the gangbanger to a suburban mother who's never committed a crime, they may have the same moral condition, but she simply hasn't had the need to act as badly, and thus hasn't. Of course, we have to separate that from public policy. It would take a god to make a fair judgment of another person's heart, so I don't even see this as a political question. But in discarding Maslow, we remove the Aristotelian approach from the table. I think more importantly, we remove Alasdair MacIntyre's approach from the table. And that may be the only construct of morality sturdy enough to hold up to even the challenges of current year subjectivity. And that's actually a shame because it seems like it would fit so well with Peterson's other philosophic perspectives. I'm guessing Peterson gave up on positive psychology because the research process seems a bit lacking and it may not work well with his commitment to the Big Five construct. Here's where I lament the fact that Maslow attempted to be a researcher when he would have made a much better philosopher. He was a good researcher for his time, but it seems no one really picked up his mantle and updated the material. Now it's all outdated and overgrown. But still, psychology goes without any real definition of mental health, and somehow continues to pretend it can just ignore this problem. I'm eventually going to present and defend what I think is the most self-evident definition of mental health in my upcoming series. But for now, let's see what we lose by losing Maslow. His intention was to study health in people and try to replicate it, essentially attempting, perhaps unintentionally, to find a way to describe Aristotle's golden mean. We study illness in medicine by studying disease. But humanist or not, that model can't really apply in psychology, although they continue to attempt it badly. They're trying to start out like a modern surgeon applying specific techniques to specific problems. But if this were medicine, we'd be back in the 1400s. before even having diagrams and a solid map of the body parts or understanding their functions. Put simply, we may have 30 evidence-based techniques of psychological treatments based on conflicting theories that may all work sometimes. But when it comes down to it, they may explain how a treatment works, but they can't really explain why. And this is because they have no description of what a functional person is supposed to be. It's also interesting, Peterson pulls from Frankl's first book, Man's Search for Meaning, but not as much from his second book. He had very original titles, didn't he? And I've never heard Peterson say anything about Gestalt theories or other attempts to give such a description of the human being. But now we're on to the two larger semi-religious questions. So first, let's consider Peterson's potential bias. He's mentioned his own struggles with depression, so first I have to ask, does the world have to be interpreted so depressingly, or is that just a projection of his own experience? Again, I want to tread delicately here. Watching one's daughter suffer as he has is certainly not conducive to having a cheery outlook. However, as Maslow pointed out, maybe we should study the best of us, and there are some people who pull off amazing amounts of suffering with joy. So I am certainly not discounting the harsh and inescapable external difficulties of life. We must certainly be prepared for these harsh realities, and I'll talk about that a little later. What I am saying is that even in the Garden of Eden, humans found a way to be unhappy with perfection, and to make themselves unhappy by wanting more than perfection. Obviously, this parallels the Buddhist pairing of suffering and desire, but we can certainly pull science into it if you like. Just search the mouse utopia experiments by Calhoun. I almost wonder if providing everything the mice needed didn't make them responsive to some kind of internal evolutionary pressures, shaping them into little rodent versions of predatory Morlocks and pacifist Eloy from H.G. Wells' Time Machine. But I digress. Now, perhaps there is some unmeasured mousy need that wasn't controlled for, but I can't help imagine that if humans spent enough time and energy attempting to convince themselves that they could only be happy with a pet unicorn, well, they could make themselves irredeemably miserable for want of it. Perhaps, just like the mouse, who living in a functional communist utopia with all their basic needs met, still found ways to become neurotic and unhappy, so would we. And I suppose you see where I'm going with this. Again, I want to be careful here as I don't want to take anything away from what Peterson has done in terms of responsibility and providing meaning. I already mentioned I absolutely love Frankl's work and entirely agree with his discussion of the importance of existential purpose. But my impression is, if Peterson's life were on a typical mythological quest, if it could be described as the monomyth, perhaps he's gotten stuck in the woods finding his way back to society. His books certainly map out the path so far into the danger and halfway home. Honestly, doesn't he strike you as Odysseus? Cunning and valiant, but washing up on the same shore again and again. If we have the tragic, I think we do need some of the Dionysian, and it's not just a metaphor. I can never say this right.
Dopaminergic.
Yeah, that system. You know dopamine? The goal-oriented and fun neurotransmitter? That's actually needed for muscle function. Someone claiming to have crippling depression isn't just being dramatic. Their muscle function and energy level is actually reduced due to the lack of joy. Meaning creates serotonin, but if someone can't even be motivated for goal setting or initiating an activity, it's a little hard for them to naturally feel proud of themselves. We actually have a biological need for positive emotions, for fun. And there are several books on the positive effects of being able to be playful, on mental health and resilience, not to mention the research on how play improves learning. Or perhaps Peterson would better fit into the idea of a grumpy bodhisattva who doesn't recognize the freeing power of his own vision. It's a bit fascinating to me as Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics seem to provide a more soothing salve when one reaches the innermost sanctum of their mystery. But perhaps the life of an emperor seems too easy to pass off. So I could mention the Greco-Roman moralist Epictetus, who was a slave and eventually earned his freedom. As the story goes, he was crippled when his master was tightening a restraint of some kind, and Epictetus said, "You'll break my leg if you make that tighter." The master did, and the leg broke. At which point Epictetus dispassionately responded with something like, "You see?" The master was so impressed by the man's reaction he granted him freedom. Ancient life had no place for snowflake culture, but amid even wretched conditions, it seems there was not much more misery than we have today. I suggest that's because humans are adaptive. But don't notice that over time we typically adjust and return to the baseline. I would also point out that bringing more joy to this state of misery is one of the primary reasons Christianity spread so quickly. And on the other side of the world, contextualizing hope for alleviation of suffering propelled the message of the Buddha. Less suffering is more joy, even without enlightenment, until our baseline adjusts again. It provides us hope that we can adjust our baseline intentionally and align our responses to the actual world. Which brings me to my last and most important point. Let's call this one an observation rather than an argument. Peterson has a very practical approach to forgiveness that actually doesn't seem to connect at all with his Christian construct. He doesn't seem to demonstrate an understanding of virtue ethics, which is fine, but it really seems like the best moral stance to blend with his philosophic ideas. Maybe he rejects it for some reason, but I don't think I've heard him mention it anywhere. Now, he certainly doesn't have the naive arrogance about human understanding to hold a consequentialist position on ethics. And I guess he seems to have a kind of particularly subjective deontology, not a universal imperative like Kant might apply to show that there's never a justification for lying, but rather a more complex subjective hierarchy of rules. Maybe something like, lying is justified only as a last resort after you've tried your best to avoid it, and perhaps only to protect the immediate physical safety of others. And perhaps even in such situations, the prohibition of lying is overridden by a greater moral imperative to protect others from unjustified violence, thus maybe lying becomes a moral obligation. Obviously, that's all just speculation. If that's the case, well, I'm fine with that too. When the liberal fascist black shirts take over and I'm hiding in your attic for wrongthink crimes, you are morally obligated to lie to protect me. Please. Thing is, it doesn't seem to match the materialistic way in which he describes forgiveness. Now, I'll try to steelman him a bit here and offer the possibility that the comments I saw were simply restricted to advice on setting appropriate practical and emotional boundaries in relationships. If so, then maybe we don't have a disagreement. But the justification I've heard him present is that we forgive because we want to receive forgiveness. Now, this could be a Christian concept. By the way you judge others, you will also be judged. Enough said. But certainly it isn't the whole picture. I go back to Aristotle, Kierkegaard, and MacIntyre for my view of virtue ethics, and suggest that we look at the best and most virtuous people we can, those people who are best at playing the kind of games that align with our values, and ask ourselves how to become that kind of person, rather than just how to do what they're doing. Peterson says that Jesus serves the mythological function of representing an ideal human to model ourselves after. From that position, it's important that humans have some amount of forgiveness in the mix, or we'll certainly fall into cycles of violence. And it has to be more than forgiveness just for people who acted in good faith or may have had good intentions, or again, we'll still end in a cycle of violence and personal misery.
I can understand the first upset for the first 2 hours after the verdict, but to keep going on like this, and to see the security guard shot on the ground, it's just not right. It's just not right, because those people will never go home to their families again. And I mean, please, we can get along here. We all can get along. We just gotta, I mean, we're all stuck here for a while. Let's try to work it out. Let's try to beat it, let's try and work it out.
We need to have forgiveness as a part of our ideal, not just for the whole society to be able to manifest it, and not even for maintaining our personal relationships, but for our inner worlds to function harmoniously. Maslow said, every superior person confronts us with our own shortcomings. To which I would add, particularly if we refuse to join the hierarchy of their game in a way that would allow us to learn from them. Every war hero has to start off as a green recruit and gets emotionally abused by a drill sergeant. They have to be able to handle that and handle being at the bottom, or they'll never handle bullets. Socrates was sentenced to death for what was best about him. Paralleling that ideal, Jesus also had to be wronged, not for an error he made, but for his virtues. As Peterson has said, the best time to punish someone is when they're intentionally trying to do good. I'm almost certain that by this he means a technical definition of punishment, which is adding an aversive which reduces a behavior. Jesus, on the cross, forgiving the men who nailed him there, was exactly the opposite, enacting the ideal for all humans despite the most effective kind of punishment. In a way, perhaps, showing the greatest amount of free will. And, if Plato is to be believed, again this is mirrored in Socrates' execution and his arguments, that it is better to be a just man who suffers miserably than an unjust man who thinks himself happy. To become ideals, both Socrates and Jesus have to be absolutely destroyed as a means of demonstrating acceptance without bitterness, establishing actual archetypes of forgiveness. But what did it gain anybody? Well, gain both of them immortality. It seems the Greeks believed that as long as your name is remembered, your shade would survive in the Elysian fields of the afterlife. In the Iliad, this is the glory that Achilles strove for by means of uncivilized violence. Socrates, however, accomplished a greater glory by neither fleeing his execution, even when provided the opportunity, nor by creating an uprising and trying to fight against it. He argued his case in the bounds of the law and accepted the law's injustice. And there's our theme again. Socrates and Jesus aren't Sisyphus. The goal isn't just carrying your cross and bearing a burden well. The point is the resurrection and eternal life, which is why Christianity was lifted up on the shoulders of its martyrs, not for fighting in combat. This is even the point that Gibbon makes in his History of Rome, when he claims the Christian tendency towards pacifism destroyed the Roman Empire. No, the Christian martyrs didn't die fighting the system, but rather refusing to lie about it, or at least refusing to lie about what they believed. They showed the empire that life was not something to be held tightly, at any cost. In Christianity, one becomes a new creature after having been completely crushed by the gears of the world. A new creature by way of absolute forgiveness. Not only forgiveness for yourself, but your release of the justified anger you have at abuses done to you by others, or even to those you love. And then taking up the responsibility of making things better, even if it was never yours. And we can see how this mirrors the giving up of karma in the East, by giving up the ownership even of your pain. So, forgiveness is really like the Christian nirvana, the destruction of the ego, an earthly escape from samsara, the repeated dying of the ego as it's overpowered and crushed on the rock of reality, a reality that is always bigger and stronger. And so let me add a third name. Job's story had an end, and here, in what I consider one of the most powerful arguments against Judeo-Christianity, Young seems to miss the point as he blames and doesn't forgive God himself. He misunderstood that the last trial Job faced was the confrontation and surrender to God, or if you prefer a non-religious version, a surrender to the brute fact that reality is bigger than you are, and you are not a god. Whether it's a creator judging humanity, or a mindless virus, reality does not care about your judgments of it. Being angry at the virus is a waste. It's an egoistic holding on to karma, a greedy holding on to your own pain, just because it's yours. So to sum up what I see in the large religions of the world, from Islam and Shintoism to everything I've talked about so far, by internal surrender, we surpass. As the god Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, if everything becomes a sacrifice to God, then you are free. The things you enjoy, the things you don't enjoy, the suffering, all of it. Like Epictetus being a slave, not fighting the powerlessness of his situation or complaining about his leg being broken. Was it just? Certainly not. Was it right? No. Was forgiveness still the best response? Yes. Even if you take action to prevent something similar from happening to you, even if you work to protect others from that situation, forgiveness is still the best starting place. And performing those actions should not be done to just achieve a victory, but rather as a sacrifice to your version of a higher power. So I'm certainly not rejecting Peterson's view of purpose. Not at all. But there is something a little bit beyond it. Something that can still be reached. And no, I'm not saying any of this is easy. And I'm not saying I can do it. But I am saying this is what it seems like to me. As I was finishing this, Milo Yiannopoulos released a letter with various criticisms of Peterson. It had a lot of personal issues, and I'm not going to pick a side on those. I see them as more the difficulties of two people attempting to navigate the obstacles of their celebrity. However, Milo did make an interesting claim that Peterson is actually a Marxist. And the more I think about it, the more I realize how damaging that critique could be. Honestly, it deserves a good pros-cons list. And while thinking about that, I also realized I can make a pretty good set of arguments that Peterson is actually a postmodern neo-Marxist. Because if you're going to start off down that road, you might as well go all the way. Turns out a simple yes or no won't cover it, because I can come up with several accepted definitions of these terms that would put him in one camp or the other. And since he's not a philosopher, I haven't heard him make any actual philosophic arguments that would directly reject one position or the other. Practical arguments, certainly, but not philosophic ones. I'm still pondering it, but at the moment I'm wondering if he's better described as a frustrated or backslidden Marxist. One who doesn't have a good replacement for the challenges of postmodernism, which could also be the definition of a postmodern philosopher. Maybe I'll make another video on that, but at the moment I still intend to put out my Theory of Everything video first. Because I do have a response and a replacement for those dumb postmodern linguistic deconstructionist So, we'll see.
Oh, you feel how soft this is? It's so soft. Oh, it feels so good to touch. It's so smooth. Oh boy, I could do this all day.
It's not that easy being red.